And what I wanted to highlight, though, this morning are the stories in these chapters that represent a shift from the early stages of this movement into what the movement would eventually become. And here are 3 shifts that I want us to focus on. So a shift from the old order to the new order, a shift from a utopian dream to a complicated and all too human reality, and a shift from a city movement to a global movement, okay? Those are the 3 shifts I want us to take a look at. So let's start with this first one. From old order to new order. So we continue to see a stark contrast between the old order and the new order. The old order is fashioning and narrating the world. They are in control of the religious imagination of Jewish folks. And they use force and fear and punishment and incarceration as their main tools of communicating. Their work is inherently violent and brutal. And they can no longer just win people to the truth. They have to force them to stay within it. So in contrast to the old order is the new order. And this new order, this movement, is refashioning and re-narrating the world around it through acts of defiance, bravery, imagination, and raw spiritual power. When Stephen is arrested, he is asked to give an account for what he believes, and he literally re-narrates the entire Old Testament and says, this points to Jesus. And it's the Christian's story. It's compelling. Their way of life is compelling. Their tools are health, healing, belonging, and transformation. And people at this point are literally walking right past drawn swords to join their ranks. Becoming a Christian could actually cost you your life at this particular moment. And people are still doing it because the news is so profound. Another strange feature of the persecution is that it's uneven. So some followers are left alone, and others are placed in prison and even murdered. And this raises an important question for the church, and this is what our main commentator for this series asks. He says, how is it that the faith of some disciples is rightly seen as a threat to the social order, while the faith of others may be seen as too inconsequential to merit attention, and or so closely aligned with the old order that is indistinguishable from it? That is a heavy-duty question for us to ask ourselves in this culture. This is an important question that we need to ask as Christians, but we need to ask it carefully. Do I live in a way that is contrary enough to the life-destroying systems of the current age to actually draw attention to myself? I'm going to repeat that. Do I live a way that is contrary enough to the life-destroying systems of the current age to draw attention from it? Even negative attention. Now, I want you to be careful when you ask this question, because right now in Canada, there are Christian nationalists that have asked this question too. But instead of living into a new way, they are trying to rebuild an old order. They see themselves, of course, as living counter to the Canadian government. And the story they tell each other is about how persecuted they are, and this fuels their whole movement. However, what they teach each other is just the old order masquerading as the Jesus way. And I don't want you to be fooled by this. They don't practice the Jesus way the way Jesus practiced the Jesus way. They are interested in power. They are interested in a return to cultural domination. The resistance they experience in Canadian society, what they like to imagine as persecution, is because people see through their rhetoric. So they experience resistance because people see through their rhetoric. And oddly enough, some of the folks who resist them are not Christians themselves, but they know that what's being taught by Christian nationalists is so counter to the gospel that they know something else must be animating them. And so we have to be careful when we ask this question, am I living in a way that is contrary to society? Because just because you're living in a way that's contrary to society doesn't mean that you're following the Jesus way. And you can take a cue from our Methodist ancestors. They asked this question of each other regularly, and this is a prayer that they would pray on New Year's Day every single year. And I think it's a really fine litmus test for what we're listening to. It says this: I am no longer mine, but yours. Put me to what you will. Place me with whom you will. Put me to doing, put me to suffering. Let me be put to work for you, or set aside for you, praised for you, or criticized for you. Let me be full, let me be empty. Let me have all things, let me have nothing. I freely and fully surrender all things to your glory and service. And now, O wonderful and holy Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer, you are mine and I am yours, so be it. And the covenant which I have made on earth, let it also be made in heaven. You can see that there's nothing nationalistic in here. There's nothing about taking Britain back. There's nothing about demanding my rights. What you see in this prayer is a genuine servant's heart, a willingness to live the Jesus way, the way Jesus lived the way. The Jesus way, at least when you do the Jesus way, the way Jesus did the Jesus way, stands in stark contrast to all ages and all times. We don't need to go looking for a fight. We don't need to whip up the troops with a phony culture war to try and take our country back. No, church. We live the Jesus way with a towel around our waists, because that's how Jesus lived the Jesus way. We follow the way that claims the last are first, the way in which servants are actually leaders, the way that scoots past the powerful and influential and seeks out the least, the last, and the lost. If you do the Jesus way, the way Jesus did the Jesus way, you will naturally find yourself at odds with the death-dealing aspects of whatever time and place you find yourself in. A shift from a utopian dream to a complicated reality. So how do we get from Acts 2, 42 to 47, where we're sharing everything in common, to what the rest of the New Testament describes, which is a constantly broken church in need of God's ongoing intervention? The church tends to be in an ongoing state of incompleteness. We are not what we want to be. We are not fixed. We are not complete. We are not finished. Why is that? Well, it's because of our ongoing failure to live the Jesus way, the way Jesus lived the Jesus way. Did I mention that the first term for the church and Christians was the way? Did I mention that yet? Okay. So every time we choose a competing allegiance over the Jesus way, we break the church. Whether it be our selfish desires or our justifications for our sin, or political, racial, and ethnic allegiances, or even personal ambition, these things all break the church. And the reason is pretty simple. You can't build the kingdom of God using the devil's tools. It's not just learning things about Jesus. It's not just even working for Jesus. It's actively, through your life, engaging in apprenticeship. It means learning and study and practice and revision and deepening work and returning back to the Jesus way over and over. It requires walking your life with Jesus. Okay, let's talk about moving from a city movement to a global movement. So Jesus, in Acts 1:8, before he pushes the bright red button on his jetpack and ascends, okay? He says, you will be my witnesses where? Anybody remember? Acts 1:8. You'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. So that is how Acts starts. But up until this point, we really have not progressed past Jerusalem. That is about to change. And next week, we're going to really see that work underway. But right up until these chapters, the movement consisted mostly of only Jewish people, and was pretty much contained to the city limits of Jerusalem. Now that is all about to change, because the persecution that Paul and others spark off does something really unexpected to this movement. It forces the church to meet the needs of people the church doesn't understand yet. People the movement in Jerusalem had no vision for. People, the movement, weren't even aware that God was capable of transforming. What in the world is God doing? This is a question that we need to ask ourselves routinely. What is God doing? Well, the story of God's work in the world is a process of calling out and calling back in. Okay, that's something that Pastor Paul taught in week 1. So what is happening? Well, we have folks who are held prisoner in their home cultures and divided by these walls of hostility, people that we know are natural enemies. And God calls people out, I know, right? God calls people out of their home culture as they are called to die to themselves, as they are to acknowledge and rid themselves of competing allegiances, as they submit to the Jesus way, they are pushed to the very edges of their home culture. Now, we don't see our cultural differences disappear, because what we read about in the book of Revelation is that it's all peoples, all tribes, all tongues gathered around the throne of God. So our cultures don't disappear. It's just that the fact that we belong to this culture is robbed of the power to separate us from each other. Our differences remain, but they are no longer an excuse to fight one another. Does that make sense? You follow me on that?